The wind came first, a low moan across the frozen plains that built to a howl before dawn, had fully broken on January 15th, 1888. The thermometer nailed to the post outside Thornton Mercantile read 12 degrees below zero at first light, and the mercury was still falling. To the west, where the sun should have painted the sky in shades of rose and gold, there was only gray, a wall of it, thick and churning, consuming the horizon like something alive and hungry. The few souls already stirring in Sage Hollow, Wyoming Territory, population 231, paused in their morning labors to watch that gray mass approach. Some crossed themselves. Others simply stood, breath pluming white in the bitter air, and felt the first fingers of true fear creep along their spines. By noon, the wall had swallowed the western ridge. By nightfall, no soul would be able to see their hand before their face, and the blizzard that descended upon the high plains would not release its grip for 19 days. 8 feet of snow would bury Sage Hollow before it was done, and the wind, exceeding 60 miles per hour at its worst, would sculpt that snow into drifts tall as houses, hard as stone. The storm came like a predator, patient and relentless, and it would feed well before the thaw. But on this morning, as the gray consumed the west and the temperature plunged toward depths that would kill exposed flesh in minutes, one man was not watching the sky. Niels Pemberton stood in the darkness of his root cellar, counting jars by lantern light, his calloused hands moving with the certainty of long practice. 800 pounds of preserved vegetables lined the earthen shelves. Salted meat hung from hooks driven into the ceiling beams. Grain filled 7 barrels, each sealed tight against moisture and vermin. He had known this storm was coming for 3 days now, ever since the sorrel mare Blaze had refused her evening grain and pressed herself against the southern wall of the barn, trembling. The animals always knew. His grandfather had taught him that in the old country, in a language that tasted of pine forests and frozen lakes. Niels Pemberton had arrived in Sage Hollow 7 years prior in the spring of 1881, a widower of 43 with hands made hard by labor and eyes made hollow by grief. He had come west from Minnesota, from a small farm outside Duluth, where he had buried his wife Margaret and their infant daughter Elsa in a single grave after the blizzard of '79. They had frozen to death 15 feet from the house, caught between the back door and the barn when the whiteout struck without warning. Margaret had been carrying Elsa to check on a sick calf. The snow had come so fast and thick that she had lost her way in the space of 3 heartbeats, wandering in circles until the cold took her. Niels had found them the next morning after the storm broke, following the faint depression in the snow where Margaret had fallen. She had curled her body around the baby, trying to keep Elsa warm with the last of her failing heat. It had not been enough. Nothing had been enough. A simple rope between house and barn would have saved them both. His grandfather Aino had known this. In the brutal winters of Finland, where darkness lasted months and the cold could crack stone, Aino had learned that survival meant connection. Literal, physical connection. He had built an elaborate system of rope lifelines connecting every structure on his small farm, every neighbor within walking distance, every essential point between home and help. When the blizzards came howling down from the Arctic, Aino and his family had walked those ropes hand over hand, never losing their way, never wandering blind into the white death that waited just beyond arm's reach. Aino had died when Niels was 17, taken not by winter but by the slow failure of a heart that had beaten through 83 years of hard living. On his deathbed, he had pressed a coil of rope into young Niels's hands and spoken words in Finnish that Niels had never forgotten. The earth endures. Build with her. Niels had failed to heed that wisdom in Minnesota. He had built his farm the American way, each structure standing alone, proud and independent. When the blizzard came, that pride had killed his family. He would not make the same mistake twice. When he arrived in Sage Hollow, leading the sorrel mare Blaze behind a wagon loaded with everything he owned, the land agent had tried to steer him toward the fertile bottomland along Sage Creek. Good soil, the man had said. Easy water. Every successful farm in the valley stood along that creek, their fields green and prosperous. Niels had shaken his head and pointed to the rocky ridge that everyone called worthless. 30 acres of stone and scrub that no one had bothered to claim because nothing would grow there, and the wind howled constant across its exposed face. The land agent had laughed. The other settlers had shaken their heads in pity for this grief-touched foreigner who did not know good land from bad. But Niels had seen what they could not. He had seen the natural windbreaks where the ridge folded in on itself, creating sheltered pockets that would stay clear even in the worst storms. He had seen the southern exposure that would catch every hour of winter sun. Most importantly, he had seen the stone formations, granite outcroppings driven deep into the earth, perfect for anchoring the network he would build. If you wanted to subscribe to more content like this, make sure to click the like button and drop a comment sharing your thoughts so far. The earth endures. Build with her. He had purchased the ridgeland for $2 an acre and begun planning before the ink dried on the deed. The tunnels came first. Niels spent the entire first summer digging, rising before dawn and working until full dark, shifting earth and stone with pick and shovel until his hands bled and his back screamed for mercy. He started beneath his own root cellar, extending it outward in a passage 6 feet high and 4 feet wide, large enough for a man to walk upright, large enough to move supplies and livestock if necessary. The earth here was good for digging, layers of packed clay and gravel that held their shape once carved, and Niels reinforced each section with railroad ties purchased from the Union Pacific Depot in Cheyenne. The railroad ties cost $4 each, and before he was done, he would use over 150 of them, more than $600 of his savings, money he had brought west from the sale of the Minnesota farm. The other settlers watched him haul those ties up the ridge road, load after load, and they whispered among themselves about the foreigner who was spending a fortune to shore up holes in the ground. By the end of the second year, the first tunnel reached the property line of his nearest neighbor, old widow Magnuson, a Norwegian woman who lived alone in a tight little cabin and asked no questions about the strange man who appeared from the earth one autumn afternoon to offer her shelter in storms yet to come. She had accepted. She had been the only one. The second tunnel ran southwest, toward the Reeves homestead. The third bent northeast, toward the Holloway farm. By the end of year 3, Niels had extended passages to 4 neighboring properties, each one shored with railroad ties, each one sloping gently downward to prevent water accumulation, each one emerging in a cellar or barn where the connection could be hidden from casual observation. He worked mostly alone, though young Thomas Reeves, a boy of 12 with curious eyes, sometimes helped him haul dirt in exchange for pennies and stories about Finland. The 4th year brought the rope lines. Above ground, where the tunnels could not reach, Niels strung a network of lifelines that would eventually span 2 miles of ridge and valley. He purchased triple-braided hemp rope at 18 cents per foot from Thornton Mercantile, enduring Caleb Thornton's smirking questions about what exactly a man needed with so much rope. He drove iron stakes 4 feet into the frozen ground at regular intervals, spacing them close enough that a man could reach from one to the next even in zero visibility. Each line was anchored at both ends to granite outcroppings or to the heavy support beams of barns and houses. The completed network resembled nothing so much as a great web spread across the ridge, with Niels' central cellar, his fortress against the cold, serving as the heart where all lines converged. 6 years. Over $600 in railroad ties alone. Another $200 in rope and iron stakes. More hours of labor than he could count, his hands permanently calloused. his joints aching in the cold, his back bent from years of digging. The people of Sage Hollow watched him build, and they talked. They talked in the mercantile when he came to purchase supplies, falling silent when he approached the counter and resuming their whispers as soon as he turned his back. They talked in the church, where the pews around him always remained empty, as if grief and madness might be contagious. They talked in the fields during harvest, leaning on their tools to watch the strange foreigner string his ropes between stakes driven into the frozen ground. To check out more stories like this one, please like and subscribe for more content every week. And Caleb Thornton, owner of the mercantile that sold Niels all that expensive rope, talked loudest of all. It was Thornton who coined the nickname that would follow Niels through the years to come. He had been standing on his porch one September afternoon, watching Niels emerge from one of his tunnel entrances, dirt-covered and squinting in the sudden light, when he turned to the cluster of farmers gathered nearby and declared in a voice meant to carry, "That is the tomb walking among us, gentlemen. Pemberton is digging his own grave and charging himself for the privilege." The laughter had been immediate and cruel. The nickname spread through Sage Hollow like fire through dry grass, and by winter of that year, even the children called him the Tomb, though not to his face, for there was something in Niels Pemberton's eyes that made even the boldest child hesitate. Thornton's wife, Harriet, a woman of considerable social influence and sharper tongue than her husband, organized the final exclusion. She spoke to the other women after church one Sunday, her voice pitched low, but not low enough, and Niels heard every word from where he stood alone by the cemetery fence. "The man is touched," Harriet Thornton said. "Grief has driven him into madness, and madness of that sort can spread like sickness. We must protect our families. No invitations to church socials, no welcomes at quilting circles. Let him dig his tombs and string his spiderwork in peace, but let us not pretend he is one of us." The women had nodded, some with reluctance and others with evident relief that someone had finally said what they had all been thinking. Niels had returned to his ridge that afternoon and said nothing of what he had heard. He had work to do. The 6th tunnel was only half completed and winter was coming, but the words stayed with him, as words always do when they are spoken to wound. Spiderwork. That was what they called his rope lines, this network of lifelines that could mean the difference between life and death when the white wall descended. Spiderwork, as if he were some mad creature spinning webs for prey that would never come. Only once did he respond to the mockery. It was spring of the 6th year, just after the final tunnel had been completed and the last rope line anchored to its granite outcropping. Niels had come down to the mercantile for flour and salt, and he found Thornton holding court with a group of farmers, describing the tomb's latest madness, how he had been seen that very morning checking his rope lines in weather so clear and mild that even the idea of a blizzard seemed laughable. "Why not tell us, Pemberton?" Thornton called out as Niels approached the counter. "When is this great storm coming that will make all your grave digging worthwhile? Should we all be stocking our cellars and stringing spiderwork across our fields?" The laughter rose again, but Niels did not flinch. He set his purchases on the counter, counted out his coins, and turned to face the room. His eyes moved slowly across the gathered faces, the smirking farmers, the amused wives, the curious children, and when he spoke, his voice was calm and level, carrying the faint accent of a language older than any of them could imagine. "My grandfather survived winters that would kill every soul in this valley. Let them talk." He gathered his purchases and walked out, leaving silence in his wake. That silence lasted only a moment before the laughter resumed, but there had been something in his voice, something ancient and knowing, that made a few of them glance toward the western horizon despite themselves. Now, on this January morning with the gray wall consuming the west, Niels Pemberton finished counting his stores and climbed the ladder from his root cellar into the cold light of dawn. The wind was building already, moaning around the corners of his cabin, and the temperature had dropped another 4 degrees since he had woken. 3 days earlier, on January 12th, he had watched the sorrel mare Blaze refuse her evening grain, pressing herself against the barn's southern wall and trembling despite her winter coat. He had seen the cattle on the distant Holloway farm bunching together in tight knots, presenting their rumps to the northwest as if bracing against a blow yet to fall. He had tasted the strange copper tang in the air that his grandfather had taught him to recognize, the taste of a killing cold not yet arrived but coming fast. If you enjoyed this video and want to see how the storm unfolds, make sure you are subscribed and have notifications turned on so you do not miss part 2. He had gone down to Thornton's store that same afternoon, not to purchase anything but to warn the dozen customers gathered there that death was coming on the wind. They needed to stock their cellars, he told them. They needed to string ropes between their houses and their barns at minimum. They needed to prepare for a storm unlike anything they had seen. Caleb Thornton had laughed loudest of all. The tomb sees doom everywhere, he declared to his appreciative audience. Bad for my rope sales if everyone listened to the graveyard prophet. Tell me, Pemberton, do you charge admission to view your tunnels, or is the madness free for all to witness? Niels had left without another word. There was nothing more to say. Now, standing in the rising wind with the gray wall growing closer by the minute, he crossed the frozen ground to the barn where Blaze stood in her stall, still trembling, still pressed against the southern wall. He placed his hand on her neck, feeling the rapid pulse beneath the warm hide, and spoke softly in the Finnish his grandfather had taught him. It comes, he told her, as I warned them, as they refused to believe. The mare turned her great dark eye toward him, and in its depths he saw his own reflection, a man of 50, weathered by grief and labor, standing alone against a storm that would bury the world in white. It comes, he said again, and when it passes, they will understand. Outside, the first flakes began to fall. The flakes fell thick and fast now, no longer the light dusting of morning, but heavy, wet clumps that struck the frozen ground and stuck. Niels stood in the barn doorway, watching the gray wall advance across the valley below, swallowing farmsteads and fence lines as it came. The Reeves place disappeared first, then the Holloway barn, then the stand of cottonwoods that marked the bend in Sage Creek. Within an hour, there would be nothing visible beyond the length of his arm. He had prepared for this. He had spent 6 years preparing for this. But the preparation had not ended with the tunnels and the rope lines. In the final months before this winter, Niels had worked with a desperate intensity that bordered on obsession, driven by the copper taste in the air and the growing certainty in his bones that this year, this season, the storm he had been building against would finally come. The root cellar had required expansion. He had spent 3 weeks in September widening the main chamber, shoring the new walls with the last of his railroad ties, creating space enough for 20 souls to shelter in relative comfort. The cost of those final ties had been $96, money he could ill afford, but money meant nothing against the weight of the dead. He had learned that lesson in Minnesota. The provisions had required multiplication. He had purchased an additional 200 pounds of flour from Thornton Mercantile, enduring the man's smirking commentary about tombs needing no bread. He had slaughtered his 2 oldest hogs 3 weeks earlier than planned, smoking the meat over hickory chips in the stone smokehouse he had built into the ridge's natural formation. 800 pounds of preserved vegetables now lined those cellar shelves, each jar sealed with wax he had rendered himself from the honeycomb of his 3 hives. The bees had not survived the early cold snap in November, but their wax lived on, protecting the food that would sustain the living through the darkness to come. The rope lines had required reinforcement. Niels had walked every foot of his 2-mile network in late December, checking each anchor stake, testing each splice where ropes joined, replacing any section where the hemp showed signs of wear or weathering. He had spent $47 on new rope, another $12 on replacement stakes, working through the short winter days until his fingers cracked and bled from the cold. The blood had frozen on the rope as he worked, leaving dark stains that marked his passage like a trail of sacrifice. Widow Magnuson had watched him check the tunnel entrance in her cellar 3 days past, her weathered face creased with the kind of concern that comes from recognizing a kindred soul. "You feel it too," she had said. Not a question. Niels had nodded. "The mare refuses grain. The cattle bunch. The birds have gone silent." The old woman had crossed herself in the Norwegian fashion, lips moving in silent prayer. "My grandmother spoke of such storms in the old country, winters that ate villages whole. This will be worse," Niels had told her. "When it comes, stay in your cellar. I will come for you through the passage." She had not argued. She had not laughed. Widow Magnuson was perhaps the only soul in Sage Hollow who understood what he had built and why, the only one who had accepted the tunnel connection without mockery or suspicion. Her acceptance had been simple and immediate when he had appeared from the earth that autumn day 6 years past. "If you say the rope saves, I believe it." My grandmother spoke of men who built such things. The others had not been so kind. The mockery had grown worse in recent months, as if the approaching storm had sharpened the community's need to deny what the animals and the air and the copper taste of coming cold all proclaimed. Caleb Thornton had made sport of Niels at every opportunity, his wit growing sharper and more public as the autumn wore on. "I hear the tomb has been buying rope again," Thornton had announced to a full mercantile just 2 weeks past, his voice carrying over the heads of a dozen customers. "Must be expecting the dead to need directions to their graves." "Tell me, Pemberton, do you tie the ropes around their ankles or their necks? If you found this story interesting so far and want to see what happens next, please like and subscribe." The laughter had filled the store, bouncing off the walls of goods and provisions that Thornton had stocked for winter. Provisions that Niels knew with grim certainty would not survive what was coming. The mercantile's roof was flat, designed for the mild winters that Sage Hollow had enjoyed for a decade, and it would collapse under the weight of 8 feet of snow as surely as pride collapsed under the weight of mortality. He had said nothing. He had paid for his rope and walked out. But Thornton had not been content with mere mockery. The man had begun offering public predictions of his own, contradicting Niels' warnings with the confidence of someone who had never known true cold, true loss, true winter. "Pemberton tells us doom is coming," Thornton had declared from the steps of the church the previous Sunday, his breath pluming white in the December air. "But I have lived in this territory for 15 years, and I tell you the weather here is kind. A bit of snow, a bit of wind, nothing that a good fire and a warm coat cannot handle." The tomb mistakes Wyoming for whatever frozen wasteland spawned his madness. The congregation had chuckled, and Harriet Thornton had smiled that tight, satisfied smile she wore whenever her husband scored a point against the foreigner. There had been others who joined the mockery, lesser voices that nevertheless cut deep. Samuel Polk, who ran the livery stable, had taken to calling the tunnel entrances grave mouths and warning children away from them as if they were places of contagion. Martin Holloway had made pointed comments about the waste of good railroad ties that could have been used for proper fencing. Even Pastor Whitfield, a man supposedly dedicated to charity and understanding, had delivered a sermon on the dangers of allowing grief to become obsession, his eyes sliding toward Niels' pew with unmistakable intent. But it was Harriet Thornton who had organized the final formal exclusion. The women of Sage Hollow met every Thursday afternoon for quilting and gossip, gathering in one another's homes to stitch and speak of matters great and small. Niels had no wife to join these gatherings, of course, but he had once been included in their orbit through simple neighborly courtesy, receiving baked goods during harvest, warm greetings at church, the small kindnesses that stitched a community together. Harriet Thornton had cut those threads one by one. "The foreigner disturbs me," she had announced at a quilting circle in early November, her needle flashing through fabric with the precision of a weapon. His tunnels, his ropes, his constant watching of the sky. It speaks of a mind unhinged by tragedy, and I worry what such a mind might do when winter truly comes. The other women had nodded, their own needles slowing as they absorbed Harriet's meaning. "I propose," Harriet had continued, "that we protect our families by limiting our association with Mr. Pemberton. No invitations, no deliveries, no welcome when he appears at our doors. Let the man have his tombs and his spider work, but let us not encourage his madness by pretending it is sanity." The vote had been unanimous. Niels had learned of this exclusion not through direct communication but through its effects. The sudden absence of warm bread left on his porch during harvest, the turned backs and averted eyes when he walked through town, the children who scattered at his approach as if he were something to fear. Widow Magnuson had told him of the quilting circle's decision, her old eyes filled with the particular sorrow of one who had known exclusion herself. "They are afraid," she had said simply. "People mock what they fear." Niels had nodded, unsurprised. Fear was the root of all cruelty, his grandfather had taught him. Men laughed loudest when the darkness pressed closest, hoping their mockery might keep the cold at bay. "Let them talk," he had told the widow. "My grandfather survived winters that would kill every soul in this valley. When the storm comes, the ropes will speak for themselves." That night, alone in his barn with the sorrel mare Blaze, Niels had spoken the words he could not share with any human soul. The fears and hopes and desperate certainties that had driven him across a continent to build his web against the coming dark. "They think I am mad," he told the mare, his hand resting on her warm neck as she stood calm and quiet in her stall. "Perhaps I am. Perhaps grief has broken something inside me that can never be mended." Blaze turned her great dark eye toward him, and in its depths he saw patience and understanding that required no words. "But I know what is coming," Niels continued, his voice dropping to a whisper that only the horse and the hay and the winter stars could hear. "I have tasted it on the air. I have felt it in the ache of my bones where the cold breaks through. I have seen it in the way you press against the southern wall, in the way the cattle bunch, in the silence of the birds." The mare nickered softly, pressing her muzzle against his chest. "They will understand when the snow buries them," Niels said. "When they cannot see their hands before their faces. When the cold claws at their doors and the wind howls like all the wolves of hell. Then they will remember the ropes they mocked. Then they will wish they had listened to the tomb." He had spoken no more that night, but the words had released something tight and bitter in his chest, allowing him to sleep for the first time in weeks without dreaming of Margaret's frozen face. The warning signs had grown impossible to ignore in the days that followed. On January 10th, Niels had noticed that the beaver dam on Sage Creek stood higher than any year previous, the creatures having built and built and built as if preparing for a flood that would come frozen rather than wet. On January 11th, he had seen the last flock of geese heading south, their formation ragged and desperate weeks later than any migration he could remember. On January 12th, the mare had refused her grain, and the cattle on every farm in the valley had begun that telltale bunching that spoke of weather their instincts understood even if their owners did not. Niels had walked through town that afternoon, stopping at every door that would open to him, which were few, and warning all who would listen, which were fewer still, that the greatest storm in living memory was bearing down upon them. Most had simply shut their doors in his face, too polite to mock openly, but too proud to heed. Some had laughed outright, and Caleb Thornton, holding court in his mercantile as always, had delivered the final dismissal that still rang in Niels's ears. "The tomb sees doom everywhere," Thornton had declared to his appreciative audience. "Bad for my rope sales if everyone listened to the graveyard prophet. Tell me, Pemberton, do you charge admission to view your tunnels, or is the madness free for all to witness?" The laughter had followed Niels out the door and down the street and up the long ridge road to his homestead, where it had finally faded into the silence of the approaching storm. Now, standing in his barn doorway on January 15th, watching the gray wall complete its consumption of the valley, Niels allowed himself one moment of something that was not quite satisfaction, but something darker, the grim vindication of a prophet whose warning had been ignored. "They will learn," he said to Blaze, who stood trembling in her stall despite the warmth of the barn. "They will all learn before this is done." The mare pressed against the southern wall, and Niels went to her, running his calloused hands along her neck, speaking the soft Finnish words his grandfather had used to calm frightened animals in the old country. "The storm speaks, and we must answer," he told her. "But you will not face it alone. No creature on this ridge will face it alone." He had brought her extra grain that morning despite her refusal to eat, had banked fresh straw around her stall, had checked the rope line that ran from the barn to the main house 3 times to ensure it remained secure. The barn was built solid, anchored to the granite outcropping that jutted from the ridge, and it would hold against winds that would tear lesser structures to kindling. Blaze would be safe here, warm and fed, while the world outside descended into white chaos. "I will come for you," Niels promised her. "Every day I will walk the rope, and I will come for you. This I swear on my grandfather's grave." The mare's trembling eased slightly, as if she understood the weight of that promise. Outside, the wind had risen to a scream, and the snow fell so thick that the barn doors had begun to accumulate drifts even in the few minutes Niels had stood watching. He could no longer see his cabin, though it stood only 40 feet distant. He could no longer see the ridge or the valley or the gray wall that had consumed them both. There was only the white, the howling, endless white, and the cold that cut through his wool coat as if it were paper. Niels closed the barn doors, secured the crossbar, and found the rope line by feel alone. The thick hemp running waist-high from the barn door to the iron stake driven 4 feet into frozen ground, then onto the next stake, then the next, leading him home through blindness that would have killed any man who trusted to sight alone. Hand over hand, he walked the rope. The wind tore at him, trying to rip him from his lifeline, and the snow drove into his face with the force of flung gravel. He could not feel his fingers within their heavy mittens. He could not feel his toes within their thick-soled boots, but he could feel the rope, solid and real beneath his grip, guiding him step by step through the chaos. 40 feet had never seemed so far. 40 feet had never meant so much. When his groping hand found the cabin door, Niels allowed himself one moment of fierce triumph before pushing inside and barring the entrance against the wind that tried to follow. He stood in the darkness of his home, breathing hard, ice crusting his beard and eyebrows, and knew with absolute certainty that the storm had only begun. 19 days, 8 feet of snow, temperatures that would plunge to 41 degrees below zero before the worst had passed. He had prepared. He had warned. He had built with the earth, as his grandfather had taught him. Now there was nothing to do but wait, and pray that when the dying time came, the ropes would prove their worth to those who had mocked them. Outside, the wind howled like a wounded animal, and the snow continued to fall. The first day brought terror. The second brought desperation. By the third, Sage Hollow had begun to die. Niels kept his count by notches carved into the timber beam above his cellar door, one mark for each dawn he could not see but knew had come by the faint graying of the white chaos beyond his frosted windows. January 16th, January 17th, January 18th. The storm did not relent. It did not pause for breath or mercy. It fed upon the valley like a living thing, a predator of incomprehensible appetite, and what it consumed, it buried. The temperature on the morning of January 17th dropped to 34 degrees below zero. Niels knew this because the whiskey in the small flask he kept for medicinal purposes had begun to thicken, a phenomenon his grandfather Aino had taught him marked the threshold between dangerous cold and killing cold. By the 18th, the whiskey would not pour at all. By the 19th, the glass itself cracked from the contraction of the liquid within. 41 degrees below zero. Cold that turned exposed flesh to leather in minutes. Cold that froze the moisture in a man's lungs if he breathed too deeply of the open air. Cold that killed without malice, without intention, with nothing but the patient inevitability of a force that had existed long before mankind and would endure long after. Niels walked the rope to the barn each morning, hand over hand through blindness that had become absolute. The snow no longer fell from above, but flew horizontally, driven by winds that exceeded 60 miles per hour, and did not cease their assault for even a single hour of respite. The drifts against his cabin door rose to 4 feet, then 6, then threatened to bury the entrance entirely until Niels began the exhausting labor of clearing them twice daily. His muscles screamed, his joints ached with a fire that never diminished. But he kept the path clear, kept the rope taut, kept Blaze fed and watered and warm in her fortified stall. He had made a promise. He would keep it. On the morning of the 19th, the mare finally ate. That small victory sustained him through what followed, the long hours in his cellar, checking his provisions, rationing his firewood, listening to the wind scream its endless fury against walls that held because they had been built to hold. 800 pounds of preserved vegetables, salted meat sufficient for 3 months of careful eating, grain and flour and honey from the 3 hives he had tended through summer's warmth. He could survive this. He had planned for this. While others had mocked, he had prepared. But survival brought its own burden, the knowledge that beyond his walls, beyond his ropes and tunnels and carefully laid provisions, his neighbors were dying. The sound came on the evening of January 19th, a pounding so faint against his cabin door that Niels first mistook it for a branch broken loose by the wind. But branches did not pound in rhythmic desperation. Branches did not cry out in voices made thin and weak by cold that stole the very breath from human lungs. He opened the door to find Pastor James Whitfield on his knees in the snow, ice coating his beard, his eyes swollen shut from snow blindness, his bare hands. Bare, God help him, bare in 40 below cold, clutching the rope that had guided him through the darkness. Niels did not hesitate. He seized the pastor beneath the arms and hauled him inside, barring the door against the wind that howled its frustration at being denied this particular prey. Whitfield collapsed against the floor, his body shaking with tremors so violent they seemed to threaten his very bones. Warm water, blankets, the slow, agonizing process of restoring circulation to hands that had begun to turn the waxy white of severe frostbite. It would be an hour before Whitfield could speak. When he did, his voice emerged as a croak that carried the weight of horrors witnessed and survived. Thornton's Mercantile collapsed on the 17th. The pastor's swollen eyes wept tears that froze on his cheeks even in the warmth of the cabin. The entire roof gave way under the snow weight. Caleb managed to get Harriet and the children out before the walls followed, but everything, every bolt of cloth, every sack of flour, every carefully stocked shelf of goods, buried beneath tons of frozen destruction. they have taken shelter in the church. 24 souls, perhaps more, crowded into a building never meant to house them through a siege. The firewood will not last another week at this consumption. Niels absorbed this information in silence. Caleb Thornton, who had called him the Tomb. Caleb Thornton, who had laughed at warnings and mocked the spiderwork of ropes that might have saved his livelihood. Caleb Thornton, whose proud mercantile now lay in ruins while the preparations of a madman remained intact. There was no satisfaction in the knowledge. There was only the cold arithmetic of survival, and the question that had haunted Niels since the storm's first breath. How many would live, and how many would die, before the weather released its grip on Sage Hollow? The pastor's next words answered that question with brutal finality. "Widow Magnuson," Whitfield whispered, and his voice broke on the name. She tried to reach her woodpile. 15 feet from her door, Pemberton, 15 feet. We found her this morning when the wind shifted enough to see. She had crawled most of the way back, but the cold. Niels closed his eyes. The widow had been the first to accept his tunnel, the only neighbor who had looked upon his work and seen wisdom rather than madness. She had let him dig the passage from her root cellar to his own, had stored provisions as he had advised, had listened when others laughed, and still she had died. 15 feet from safety, 15 feet from warmth and life and all the things that separated the living from the dead. Because she had not used the tunnel. Because she had trusted her own strength against a storm that recognized no strength but its own. "The Reeves boy," Whitfield continued, and now tears flowed freely down his frost-bitten cheeks. "William, 7 years old. The Soddy flooded with snow when the drift collapsed the eastern wall. Martha held him through the night, Pemberton. Held him and sang to him and watched him slip away in her arms. He asked for his father at the end. Asked if his father would be proud of him for being brave. Thomas Reeves had helped Niels haul dirt for pennies, a boy of 12 with calloused hands and honest eyes. Thomas had a brother. Had. The arithmetic of death updated itself with merciless precision. "Martin Holloway," Whitfield said. His cattle barn, the weight of snow and wind and his own refusal to anchor the structure properly brought it down around him while he tried to save his stock. Buried alive beneath the timbers he had criticized you for buying. His widow found him after the collapse, one arm reaching toward the door. He almost made it. Almost. 3 deaths. 3 souls claimed by the storm that had not yet reached its midpoint. And beyond those 3, the pastor continued, his voice growing steadier as the warmth of the cabin restored his strength. There were others hovering at the edge, frostbite claiming fingers and toes, fever spreading through the crowded church, children crying from hunger as rations dwindled and the shelves that had once held Thornton's goods lay buried beneath ruins that no one could excavate in such weather. "How did you find my rope?" Niels asked. The pastor's swollen eyes turned toward him, though they could not see. "I remembered your words," he said, "that day in the store, when Thornton mocked you for a graveyard prophet. You said your grandfather survived winters that would kill every soul in this valley. I prayed, that if any man could survive this, it would be the one who had prepared for it. So I walked toward the ridge, blind and half-frozen, trusting that the tomb had built something worth finding. And there it was, your rope running through the darkness like a thread of salvation. I followed it here." Niels rose from his chair and moved to the small window, scraping frost from the glass with fingers that had long since lost their sensitivity to cold. Beyond lay nothing but white chaos, the same howling blindness that had persisted since the storm's first breath. "How many in the church?" he asked. 27 when I left. Perhaps more if the families from the Southern Valley have made their way there. 27 souls crowded into a building without adequate provisions. 27 souls burning through firewood at a pace that would leave them frozen within the week. 27 souls who had mocked his preparations and scorned his warnings and called him names that reduced his grief and wisdom to objects of ridicule. 27 souls who would die if he did nothing. Niels thought of Margaret, of Elsa, of the 15 feet that had separated them from life and hope, and all the years they might have shared. He thought of his grandfather Ino, who had built his rope systems not merely for his own survival, but for the survival of neighbors who had doubted and criticized and failed to understand, until the killing cold came and taught them otherwise. The tunnel to Widow Magnuson's root cellar, Niels said. It runs beneath the southern face of the ridge. From her cellar, there is access to the surface near the old creek bed. Whitfield's damaged eyes widened. You built tunnels to the neighboring farms? 7 passages, Niels said, connecting every homestead on this ridge to my central cellar. I offered to extend the network further, but none would accept my labor. They called the tunnels grave mouths and swore they would never crawl through earth like animals. He paused, and when he spoke again, his voice carried no bitterness, only the weary acceptance of a prophet whose warnings had been ignored until proof came in the form of death. Now we shall see if their pride survives where their buildings did not. The pastor tried to rise, then fell back against the blankets Niels had wrapped around him. You would help them? After everything they said and did? Niels turned from the window. His face, lit by the flickering glow of the stove, showed no anger, no triumph, no satisfaction at the humbling of those who had mocked him. There was only the grim resolution of a man who understood what the storm demanded and knew himself capable of providing it. My grandfather did not build his ropes for the worthy alone, Niels said. He built them for all who needed them. The snow does not distinguish between those who prepared and those who did not. It kills with equal appetite. And his voice caught, then steadied, I remember too well what it is to find loved ones frozen in the snow, 15 feet from safety. I will not stand by while that fate claims others if it lies within my power to prevent it. He moved to the heavy coat hanging by the door, the thick mittens, the wool scarf that would protect his face from winds that cut like razors. Rest, he told the pastor. Regain your strength. When you can walk, I will show you the rope system and how to navigate it. Then you will return to the church and bring them here. Those who can make the journey, those who are willing to trust the work of a man they called mad. They will come, Whitfield said with sudden conviction, after what I have seen, after the death and destruction that has fallen upon those who refused your wisdom. They will come, Pemberton. They will crawl through your tunnels on their hands and knees and thank God for the madness that built them. Niels pulled on his mittens and reached for the door. Let them come, he said simply. Let them all come. There is room enough, and provisions enough and warmth enough for every soul in Sage Hollow who is willing to accept it. The ropes are faith made visible. That is what my grandfather taught me. Something to hold when you cannot see the path. And the path leads here, to this place I built because I knew what was coming. The path leads to survival. He opened the door to the howling darkness, found the rope by touch, and began the long journey to the barn where Blaze waited. Behind him, the pastor wept, whether from relief or grief, or the simple overwhelming emotion of a man who had walked blind through death and found salvation at the end of a rope. Even Whitfield himself could not say. The storm raged on. 19 days would pass before its fury finally exhausted itself. 8 feet of snow would bury Sage Hollow, transforming the familiar landscape into an alien wasteland of white drifts and buried structures and the terrible silence that follows catastrophe. But in the tunnels beneath the ridge, in the passages that connected root cellar to root cellar, in the central chamber where Niels Pemberton had stored 800 pounds of provisions against this very hour, there life would persist. There, the ropes and rails and carefully constructed passages would prove their worth beyond any argument or mockery. And there, in the days that followed, the people of Sage Hollow would learn what the man they called the Tomb had known all along: that preparation was not madness but wisdom, that building with the earth was not retreat but resistance, that the voice of a prophet is never so clear as when the catastrophe he foretold arrives to prove him right. "The storm speaks," Niels murmured into the wind as he walked the rope toward the barn. "And we must answer." The barn door nearly tore from his grip as Niels hauled it open against the wind, but he held fast, his mittened hands closing on the frozen wood with the stubborn strength of a man who had spent 6 years preparing for this very moment. Inside, Blaze stood in her stall, head lifted, ears pricked forward at his approach. She had eaten at last. The grain bucket was empty, the first time since January 12th, and something in her dark eyes seemed calmer, as if she sensed that the worst had passed even while the storm still raged. He spent an hour with her, checking her water, forking fresh straw into the stall, speaking the soft Finnish words his grandfather had used to calm frightened animals. Then he began the systematic work of rescue. The tunnel to Widow Magnusson's cellar was the first passage he checked, though he already knew what he would find there. Her root cellar stood empty, cold, abandoned. She had never made it to the safety she had accepted when others refused. He paused at the ladder leading up to her cabin, pressing his palm against the frozen earth as if offering a prayer, then turned back toward his own cellar. The passage to the Reeves homestead came next. Here he found life, Martha Reeves, crouched in the darkness with her surviving son Thomas, the 12-year-old who had helped Niels haul dirt for pennies. They had discovered the tunnel entrance in desperation after the church became too crowded, remembering the passage Niels had offered years ago that they had been too proud to acknowledge. "Thomas," Niels said, "bring your mother. Follow me." In the central cellar, with its 800 pounds of preserved vegetables and 3 months of salted meat, Niels settled Martha Reeves beside the small stove and wrapped her in blankets. Her eyes were hollow, her face gaunt from grief and hunger. Her younger son William had died in her arms, and that knowledge lived in every line of her body. "The boy," Niels said carefully, sitting across from her. "Thomas told me. I am sorry." Martha looked up at him, and in her gaze he saw not blame, but a terrible understanding. 15 feet, she whispered. He was 15 feet from the tunnel entrance when the snow took him. "We were trying to reach you, and the whiteout came so fast, and I could not, her voice broke. Niels reached across and took her cold hands in his own calloused grip. 15 feet, he repeated. "It is the cruelest distance. It is far enough to doom and close enough to haunt. I know this. I have lived this." She wept then, and he let her weep, and Thomas sat beside his mother with his young face aged beyond its years. Over the following days, as the storm continued its relentless assault, Niels organized systematic rescue through his tunnel network. Pastor Whitfield recovered enough to navigate the rope lines, and he became the bridge between the church shelter and Niels' cellar, guiding survivors in groups of 3 and 4 through passages they had once called grave mouths. 17 souls in total made that journey. They crawled through earth like animals, as they had sworn they would never do, and they emerged into the warm glow of lantern light to find provisions they had not earned and shelter they had mocked. Niels fed them without distinction. Those who had organized his exclusion ate from the same stores as those who had simply remained silent. Those who had coined cruel nicknames received equal portions to those who had never spoken against him. He taught each survivor how to navigate the rope system, explaining the principles his grandfather had established: the spacing of anchor points, the triple-braided hemp that would not fray in wind, the iron stakes driven deep enough to hold against any force. "Your mercantile rope," he told Caleb Thornton's wife Harriet when she arrived half-frozen and weeping with gratitude, "the very rope your husband sold me while laughing at my purposes. It has saved your life." Perhaps there is a lesson in that. Harriet Thornton could not meet his eyes. Her children, 3 daughters ranging from 6 to 14, huddled around her, their faces pale with cold and hunger, and the dawning understanding that everything their father had built lay buried beneath 8 feet of snow. The storm broke on February 3rd, 19 days after its first breath had swept across Sage Hollow. The silence that followed was more profound than the howling had been. Niels emerged from his cabin into a landscape transformed beyond recognition. Familiar ridges buried, fence posts vanished, entire structures reduced to vague white lumps in a sea of frozen white. The death count reached its final tally in the days that followed. Widow Magnuson, William Reeves, Martin Holloway, the baker's wife from town, found frozen in her husband's arms in their collapsed shop. Old Samuel Wright, who had run the feed mill for 30 years. 6 souls in total, claimed by a storm that could have taken many more. Sage Hollow buried its dead when the ground thawed enough to accept them, and the community that emerged from that terrible January was not the same community that had entered it. The gathering came in March. It was Pastor Whitfield who called them together, his vision partially restored, but his eyes forever changed by the frostbite that had nearly claimed them. The church had been hastily repaired, its roof shored with timbers salvaged from the ruins of buildings that had not survived, and every surviving soul in Sage Hollow crowded into its pews on a Sunday morning when the first hints of spring touched the air. Niels Pemberton sat alone in the back row, as he had sat alone for 7 years, expecting nothing different. The habits of exclusion do not break easily, and he had no desire to force himself into spaces where he remained unwelcome. But Pastor Whitfield had other intentions. "Before we speak of recovery," the pastor began, his voice carrying through the silent church, "we must speak of reckoning. We have been spared, most of us, through no virtue of our own. We survived because one man among us prepared for what the rest of us refused to believe was coming. We survived because that man shared his provisions and his shelter and his wisdom without asking anything in return, not even acknowledgement of how grievously we had wronged him." The pastor paused, his damaged eyes finding Niels in the back row. "It is time, I think, for those who mocked to speak, for those who ridiculed to confess, for those who organized exclusion to face what their pride nearly cost us all." A long silence followed. Then Caleb Thornton rose from his seat near the front. The man who had coined the nickname that followed Niels through years of isolation looked diminished now. His prosperous belly had shrunk from weeks of rationed meals. His fine wool coat showed patches where moths or mice had found it during the long burial. His hands, which had counted coins and measured rope with such confidence, trembled as they gripped the pew in front of him. "I called him the tomb," Thornton said, his voice cracking on the words. "I stood on my porch and watched him emerge from his tunnels, covered in dirt that represented years of honest labor, and I declared to anyone who would listen that Pemberton was digging his own grave and charging himself for the privilege. I laughed. I made others laugh. I said he saw doom everywhere, and that his warnings were bad for my rope sails." He stopped, swallowing hard, and when he continued his voice was barely above a whisper. "My mercantile is gone. Every piece of inventory I spent 15 years accumulating lies crushed beneath my own roof. A roof I was too proud to reinforce because I believed a building in town was safer than a cellar on a ridge. My wife and daughters survived only because they crawled through tunnels I had mocked as grave mouths. Tunnels built with railroad ties I had criticized as waste and lined with rope I had sold while laughing at the buyer. He turned to face Niels directly. I watched my wife eat from stores that should have been mine to provide, stores that belonged to a man I had made a pariah. I watched my daughters warm themselves by a fire built from wood he had stockpiled while I stockpiled nothing but contempt. You saved my family, Pemberton. You saved them, despite everything I did to make this community reject you. I do not know how to ask forgiveness for that. I do not know if I deserve it. But I am asking nonetheless. Thornton sat down heavily, his shoulders shaking. Harriet Thornton rose next, her voice steadier than her husband's, but her eyes bright with unshed tears. I organized the women to exclude him, she said. I stood outside this very church and spoke where he could hear, declaring him touched by madness and dangerous to our families. I told the quilting circle that no invitation should reach his door, that no welcome should warm his threshold, that we must protect ourselves from his strangeness. She pressed her handkerchief to her lips before continuing. The storm showed me what protection truly means. It means crawling through earth on your hands and knees while your children weep with cold. It means accepting shelter from a man you had publicly scorned. It means watching him feed your daughters the same portions he fed everyone else, without a single word of reproach, without a single glance of accusation. I have never known such shame as I felt in that cellar, eating his food, warmed by his fire, alive because of his preparations, while I remembered every cruel word I had spoken against him. She turned toward Niels. I asked God's forgiveness before I could ask yours. I do not know if either will be granted, but I owe you my life and the lives of my children, and I will spend whatever years remain to me trying to deserve the salvation I did nothing to earn. Pastor Whitfield spoke next, though his role was more witness than mocker. I preached a sermon on grief becoming obsession, he confessed. I used your example without naming you, but everyone knew of whom I spoke. I suggested that your preparations were evidence of a mind unable to move beyond loss, unable to accept that death cannot be outrun. He touched his damaged eyes with gentle fingers. I walked blind through a storm that killed 3 of my congregation. I walked blind because I had been blind long before the snow took my sight. Blind to the wisdom of a man who understood winter in ways I had never imagined. You gave me shelter when I stumbled to your door, Pemberton. You gave me warmth and food and medicine for my eyes. And when I recovered enough to walk, you sent me back to save others who had mocked you alongside me. I do not ask forgiveness. I ask only that you know how deeply I regret my failure to see what you saw all along. Thomas Reeves stood then, the boy of 12 whose young voice carried a weight no child should bear. I helped you haul dirt, he said. I took your pennies and listened to your stories about Finland. But when the other boys called you the tomb, I laughed with them. I wanted them to like me more than I wanted to be honest about what I knew, that you were wise and they were foolish. My brother is dead. William is dead, because we did not reach your tunnel in time. And I cannot stop thinking that if I had spoken up, if I had told my mother about your preparations, instead of staying silent to protect my place among boys who mocked you, William might have lived. He wiped his face roughly. I do not deserve forgiveness. I had knowledge that could have saved my brother, and I buried it to save my pride. But I wanted you to know that I remember your stories. I remember what your grandfather taught you, and I will spend my life trying to be worthy of the pennies you paid me. Martha Reeves did not rise. She could not, still weak from grief and privation, but her voice carried from where she sat. I refused your tunnel, she said. When you offered to extend the passage to our homestead, I said we had no need of charity from a man who lived in holes. I called your work unwholesome. I said the earth was for the dead, not the living. She pressed her hand to her chest as if her heart pained her. I held my son while he died. 15 feet from your tunnel. 15 feet from safety. And I knew, even as the cold took him, that my pride had killed him more surely than the storm. I cannot ask forgiveness for that. I cannot ask anything. I can only tell you that I understand now what I refused to understand before. That preparation is love, and that love does not care whether we deserve to receive it. To check out more stories like this one, make sure you give this video a like and subscribe to the channel. The church fell silent. Every eye turned toward Niels Pemberton, still seated alone in the back row, his weathered face unreadable in the pale spring light filtering through the windows. He rose slowly, his joints aching from the years of labor that had prepared him for this moment. He walked to the front of the church with the deliberate pace of a man who had learned that haste rarely served him, and he turned to face the congregation that had excluded him for 7 years. My grandfather Eno used to say that rope is just faith made visible, he began. Something to hold when you cannot see the path. He said those words to me when I was young, in a language most of you have never heard, and I did not understand them fully until I buried my wife and daughter in Minnesota soil. He paused, letting the silence gather weight. They froze 15 feet from our house. 15 feet. Margaret was carrying our infant daughter Elsa to check on a sick calf, and the whiteout came so fast that she lost her way between one breath and the next. I found them the next morning, curled together in the snow, Margaret trying to keep our baby warm with the last of her failing heat. It was not enough. Nothing was enough. His voice did not waver, though the words carried the weight of years. I came to Sage Hollow because I could not stay in a place where every corner reminded me of what I had lost. But I also came because I knew I would not make the same mistake twice. My grandfather had shown me how to build with the earth, how to string ropes between structures, how to prepare for storms that killed without mercy or distinction. I failed to heed that wisdom once. I would not fail again. He looked at Caleb Thornton, at Harriet, at the pastor and the grieving mother and the boy who had helped him haul dirt for pennies. You have asked forgiveness, he said. Some of you have said you do not deserve it. Others have wondered if it can even be granted. I will tell you what I believe. He straightened, and in his bearing was something of the grandfather who had survived 83 Finnish winters. Forgiveness is not mine to give like a coin passed from hand to hand. It is not a debt that can be repaid or a ledger that can be balanced. What was said was said. What was done was done. The widow is still dead. The Reeves boy is still dead. Martin Holloway is still dead. My speaking words of absolution will not change any of that. A murmur ran through the congregation, but Niels raised his hand and they fell silent. But I will tell you this. I did not build my tunnels for the worthy. I did not string my ropes for those who believed me. I built them because my grandfather taught me that the earth endures, that if we build with her instead of against her, we might endure as well. I built them because I knew what was coming, and I knew that when it came, the snow would not distinguish between those who had prepared and those who had not. It would kill with equal appetite. And his voice caught, then steadied. I could not stand by and watch it take you, not when I remembered too well what it was to find loved ones frozen in the snow, close enough to safety that their arms were still reaching for the door. He let the words settle into the silence. I cannot give forgiveness like a gift, but I can give what my grandfather gave me: knowledge, wisdom, the understanding of how to survive what the high plains will inevitably send against us. Another storm will come. Not this year, perhaps, not next year, but eventually the gray wall will rise in the west again, and the wind will howl, and the snow will fall until it buries everything we have built. He looked from face to face, meeting each pair of eyes in turn. When that day comes, I want every homestead in this valley to have tunnels and rope lines and provisions enough to outlast the worst that winter can deliver. I want the knowledge my grandfather carried from Finland to spread until no child of Sage Hollow ever freezes 15 feet from safety. I will teach anyone who wishes to learn. That is what I offer. Not forgiveness. That is between each of you and your own conscience. But preparation, partnership, the chance to build together what I built alone. He returned to his seat in the back row, and Pastor Whitfield called for a moment of silent reflection, and the gathering came to its end with prayers for the dead and promises for the living. In the years that followed, those promises were kept. Caleb Thornton became the first to rebuild according to Niels Pemberton's specifications. He drove iron stakes 4 feet into the frozen ground around his reconstructed mercantile and strung triple-braided hemp rope to every structure within reach. He purchased railroad ties at cost and helped his neighbors construct tunnel systems connecting cellars across the town. The man who had mocked spiderwork spent his remaining decades teaching others how to spin those webs. The Reeves homestead became a model of preparation. Young Thomas, who had helped haul dirt for pennies, grew into a man who constructed tunnel networks across 3 counties. He married a schoolteacher from Cheyenne and raised 4 children who knew the Finnish words for rope and anchor and shelter before they knew their letters. He visited Niels Pemberton every Sunday until the old man's death, and he was the one who carved the inscription Niels requested. Harriet Thornton organized quilting circles of a different sort, gatherings where women stitched emergency supply lists and preparedness plans into decorative samplers that hung in every kitchen. She never again excluded anyone from her social calendar, and she made certain that her daughters understood the difference between true strength and the brittle pride that had nearly killed them all. The phrase "walking the tomb" transformed in the community's vocabulary. Once a mockery, it became a mark of honor, a phrase that meant preparing against impossible odds, building against the certainty of disaster, refusing to let pride or convention override practical wisdom. Neighboring settlements heard the stories of Sage Hollow's survival and sent delegations to learn the techniques. By the turn of the century, the Pemberton Passage system had been adopted by over 200 homesteads across Wyoming and Montana. Niels Pemberton watched these changes with quiet satisfaction. He expanded his tunnel network to connect 14 properties by the time his aging body could no longer manage the labor. He trained 17 men and women in the precise art of shoring passages with railroad ties, and he saw his grandfather's wisdom take root in soil that had once rejected it. The sorrel mare Blaze died in the spring of 1893, her great heart finally giving out after 16 years of faithful service. Niels buried her on the southern slope of the ridge, where the morning sun would warm the earth above her, and he planted a small wooden cross that bore only her name and the Finnish word for companion. He outlived 11 orphans of the Great Blizzard, children whose parents had perished in that terrible January, children he had taken into his home and raised with the same stubborn devotion he had brought to his tunnels. They called him grandfather in the Finnish tongue, and when they grew and scattered across the territory, they carried his knowledge with them like seeds of survival cast upon fertile ground. Niels Pemberton died in the spring of 1935 at the age of 89 in the same root cellar where he had counted jars during the Great Blizzard. His adopted grandchildren surrounded him, their voices soft with grief and gratitude, and his last words were in Finnish, a phrase they did not understand but carefully transcribed for later translation. The earth endures. Build with her. Nearly 50 years after the storm that proved him a prophet, the people of Sage Hollow gathered one final time to honor the man who had saved them. They came by automobile and on horseback and on foot, filling the rebuilt church and spilling out into the spring sunshine. Pastor Whitfield's successor read from a passage that spoke of prophets unheeded and vindicated. And one by one, the survivors and their descendants spoke of what Niels Pemberton had taught them. If you have enjoyed this story and want to hear more stories about strength and survival, please hit that subscribe button and leave a comment below telling me what you thought. The central cellar still stands. Visitors from across Wyoming and Montana come to walk its passages, to run their hands along the railroad ties that Niels purchased with $600 of his savings, to follow the rope lines that still connect the original 7 homesteads. The tunnels have been reinforced with modern materials, but their essential architecture remains unchanged. 6 feet high, 4 feet wide, sloping gently to prevent water accumulation, each passage a testament to practical wisdom and inherited knowledge. Above the entrance, carved into a granite lintel that Niels himself placed, are the words that have guided 3 generations of High Plains homesteaders. The earth endures. Build with her. Young visitors often ask about the inscription and the guides. Many of them, descendants of Thomas Reeves or other survivors, explain that the words come from a Finnish farmer named Aino, who lived through 83 winters in a land of endless cold and darkness, who taught his grandson that preparation is not madness but love, and who died with a rope coiled in his hands. Aino would have recognized this place. The tunnels driven deep into earth that endures. The ropes strung between stakes driven 4 feet into frozen ground. The provisions stored against winters yet to come. He would have understood that his grandson had not merely survived, but had transformed survival into a gift given freely to those who had once scorned it. He would have been proud.